So the different remedies for the Great Depression. The most well-known one is the United States under President Franklin Roosevelt, his New Deal plan. So basically, interestingly, the United States didn't want to incorporate permanent socialistic measures. What it wants to do is reform capitalism enough to try to save it, right? So it increases government intervention in the economy, but it never intends to become a fully socialistic country, right? So notable measures, there's sort of the alphabet soup plans that result from the New Deal. There is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, that raised prices to try to help farmers. So in other words, again, remember that with the overproduction in the 1920s, farmers oftentimes were actually spending more to produce than they were actually taking money in. And so the AAA makes prices high enough so that agriculture was still sustainable. You also have the National Recovery Act, which was attempting to fix prices and wages because, again, they were not at a sustainable level, but the NRA was actually found unconstitutional. And the Works Progress Administration also a very significant attempt to remedy the economy. It provided tons of public works jobs to try to combat the 25% unemployment rate. This is going to also just prevent social uprising because, of course, when people are unemployed and people are unhappy with their government, they might also decide to stage uprisings. So the Works Progress Administration was important not only in trying to establish more jobs, but also just keeping the peace. The United States also follows the examples of Germany and Britain by starting to establish social welfare programs, so things like Social Security, old age pensions, unemployment benefits. So this is going to be a significant change for the American economy starting in the 1930s. This also will influence other European countries who have not yet incorporated social welfare programs. Arguably, what the New Deal's approach is, we could call it Keynesian. Again, referring back to the economist John Maynard Keynes, the same one, if you remember, who wanted Europe to be less harsh on Germany because it would be better for Europe's economy overall. Same guy. So the Keynesian approach basically was supporting public works programs to try to permanently prop up the economy. So again, not a sort of laissez-faire approach. The idea is that the government should adopt programs that actually will make the economy sustainable, make sure that it never collapses, and make sure that employment is guaranteed. Other countries' responses. Scandinavia arguably recovered from the Depression the best. Right? Part of this is because it has a socialist government. It incorporates collaborative farming rather than the individualized capitalist farming that we saw in the United States that was so bad when overproduction ultimately made prices sink. Collaborative farming made it so that prices were more stable and so that no one farmer would be affected too adversely. You also had labor leaders working together again to make sure that prices were at a sustainable level, and make sure that wages were also at a place that would keep all workers satisfied, prevent uprisings. Also, the Scandinavian government paid for increased welfare benefits. They raised taxes. So maybe initially people might not like a raise in taxes, but ultimately, since it provided such a valuable service to the population, particularly those in need of assistance, like the poor, like the elderly, this was something that was received well. In general, in Scandinavia, these socialist measures were important because just like the Works Progress Administration in the U.S., it prevents mass uprisings. People have unemployment benefits, people have food, people have jobs. So in general, this sense of social security is going to make it so that people are less apt to revolt. So Scandinavia is a good example of success. All right, in Britain, we already talked in a previous video about how Britain abandons the gold standard, which worked to a certain extent, but just was not quite enough. It also works to reorganize its industry. It increases tariffs, so to try to make sure that the British domestic economy is sound. Of course, all these tariffs, again, are going to kind of cripple international trade, like we discussed with the Hawley-Smoot tariff. British government also, they cut government spending. They try to balance the budget. They do quite a lot in the first few years of the Depression. However, still, despite the significant measures of the British economy, the unemployed still don't have enough welfare programs to live on. All right, so one of the things that the British economy does in particular is they try to focus on the new industries that are developing. They work towards bolstering the automotive industry and the production of electrical appliances more than anything else. And they also are only responding to the domestic demands for these products. So they don't care about whether or not people in the United States want to buy these products. They only care whether or not people in Britain do. That way they can have more influence over production, employment in these industries, as well as setting prices. And because of these different economic measures, Britain's economy actually recovered quite a bit by 1932 or so, arguably. Economists say that the years after 1932 were better than they were in the 20s. Realize that a lot of people ignored the symptoms of the Great Depression in the 20s, so Britain might actually have been worse off than a lot of historians originally perceived it to be in the 20s. All right. Also, like many other countries, what you're going to see is even though initial economic recovery starts in the early 30s or so, it's really not until rearmament leading into World War II that the economy recovers permanently. All right, France. Actually, because France was less industrialized than Britain, it was not impacted immediately by the Great Depression like Britain, the United States, and Germany. But it is going to eventually feel the pains of the Great Depression. What we're going to see is that that in France in particular, you're going to have increased class tensions as a result of the Depression, and you're going to see that that there are going to be a lot of right-wing factions that emerge and believe that the only solution to the problems of the Great Depression is to develop a more fascist economy, right? A totalitarian authoritative state, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. So we're going to see actually that what we see in France is that the multi-party system has some problems in it if there are these people that are suddenly emerging calling for fascism. The response to this sudden desire for fascism is going to take shape in the Popular Front. This is going to be an attempt to stop the threat of fascism, right? So the Popular Front is going to be a coalition of Republicans, socialists, communists, and radicals. They're going to be led by Leon Blum, and they're going to be successful in stopping these fascists. We know, obviously, France is not one of the fascist dictatorships that emerges in the 30s. So because of the efforts of groups like the Popular Front, they continue to have a democratic parliament. And in the 1936 elections, the Popular Front is going to experience significant victories. So the conservatives are going to lose influence. So that's very positive to prevent France from falling to fascism, like countries. Unlike countries like Germany and Italy that did become fascist. France is going to incorporate its own version of the New Deal. It's going to introduce increased social reform measures. It's going to bolster unions. It's going to incorporate paid vacations, 40-hour work weeks. Again, things that are going to help secure the sense. It's going to basically help workers feel more secure, help workers have more steady wages, also guarantee employment by limiting the amount of hours any worker can work in 1 week. It makes it so that more people ultimately can have jobs. However, the French New Deal is not going to be overly successful. There are going to be some significant inflation rates. Also, fascists are going to be very agitated, and they're going to kind of this conservative reaction is going to make it so that the French New Deal is not going to be successful in Parliament, but still we see that at least there's that attempt at that kind of response like the United States. The French are also going to prove to be divided in terms of their reaction to the Spanish Civil War. The Popular Front is going to basically be destroyed because there are going to be these different interpretations about how France should respond to the Spanish Civil War. The communists want to support the Republicans in Spain, but the conservatives want Spain to emerge as a fascist state. All right, so basically this makes the Popular Front fall apart. So France, actually, we're going to see does not recover particularly well in the Great Depression, and it's going to be really politically divided, even though the Popular Front is going to stop fascism from taking over France. At the same time, because of the failure of the French New Deal, we see that there's a significant kind of weakness in the multi-party system in France. So in general, Great Depression, what we know is that all countries had different attempts to remedy the symptoms of the depression, so you should be familiar with all of those. All right, you should be familiar with the general causes, and most importantly, you should understand that it was the Great Depression that totally destroys that sense of optimism that was starting to emerge in the late 20s in European countries, particularly Germany, when Germany was restoring its relationship with the rest of Europe through the Locarno Pact. Germany looked like it might have recovered, but because of the Great Depression, it completely destroys its economy, weakens the Weimar Republic, and that vulnerability is going to allow a fascist system under Hitler to emerge, and again lead to World War II.